listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello, you're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rod Davis, and this week we are in conversation with Aaron Horvath. Now, Aaron is a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Centre on Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford University. And he writes a lot about various issues to do with organisational structures and kind of measurement within the non-profit sphere. And I sat down particularly to talk with Aaron about a really interesting paper that he recently published, which is titled Organisational Supererogation and the Transformation of Non-Profit Accountability, which is the sort of usual catchy title for a journal article. But essentially this paper is about a really interesting bit of research that Aaron's done, looking at data on what happened when new measurement requirements were imposed on non-profits in the San Francisco Bay Area between starting in 2002 but going all the way through to 2016. And essentially the finding that actually, contrary to what you might expect, organisations, rather than sort of doing the bare minimum, went above and beyond what was required of them, hence the idea of supererogation, which essentially means kind of doing something that is above and beyond duty. So I'll put a link in the show notes to where you can have a look at the paper and a shorter version of an article summarising that Aaron's done. But yeah, we had a really great conversation, kind of talking around the paper and also broader issues around accountability and measurement in the non-profit sphere. So we talked a bit about the idea of supererogation in the paper and why it was perhaps that non-profits were kind of going above and beyond when it came to measurement and reporting. We talked about what sort of form that took. Was it that they were measuring new things, or was it that they were using kind of more narrative or qualitative tools to tell a story about the work that they did? And we talked a bit about whether there were any risks involved in that, whether actually kind of measuring more than you're required to can present some challenges for non-profit organisations. We also talked a bit about the kind of wider context on why there's been, an increased emphasis on measurement and metrics in the non-profit world, certainly over the last few decades. And we talked about whether there's, a danger that externally imposed metrics that are kind of presented for non-profits to comply with, whether they reinforce a tendency for non-profits to see themselves as accountable not to their recipients or even to the people supporting them, but instead accountable to regulators, and whether that was kind of a problem. We talked about whether the imposition of rankings and ratings and metrics brought with it the danger of a greater degree of homogeneity and more sort of everything being the same in civil society, and might undermine the kind of pluralism and diversity that is often seen as one of the strengths of civil society. And we talked about whether the kind of fundamental idea of measurement and the goal of measurement being that we're working towards some kind of universal measure that allows us to accurately assess the value of all work in civil society, regardless of cause area, whether that is still an idea that people yearn for or whether it's kind of fundamentally misguided. And if there are elements in the work of civil society that we can't capture in our current measurement systems, what's the conclusion there? Do we need to get better at measuring and more sophisticated, or do we need to become more comfortable with the idea that there will always be some things that aren't measured? We also talked a little bit towards the end of the conversation about another article that Aaron had out relatively recently, a joint article with Micah McElroy, about limited liability companies and their use as a kind of new structure for philanthropy, particularly in the US, and some of the challenges that brings around accountability and transparency within big money philanthropy. So it was really interesting as well. Anyway, enough of me talking. Without further ado, let's go into the conversation. I will be back at the end for the usual bit of housekeeping and tidying up. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with Aaron Horvath. Hi there, Aaron.
Hello.
Oh, well, great to have you on the podcast. And for people listening, I'm sure I've done some biographical information up front, but Aaron is a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. And I wanted to talk to you about a whole bunch of things, but I guess the centerpiece was a paper that you recently had out as a journal article, and you had a version, I think, on Histphil as well, which kind of centers all around some work you've done looking historically at a group of nonprofits in the US, but in terms of how they responded to changes in what was demanded of them when it comes to measurement, and some sort of slightly surprising findings about the way in which they did respond. So I don't know if the best place is for you to just kind of outline what it was you looked at and what the kind of key thing that you found was.
Yeah, maybe the best place to start is just to give a little background on the project itself, because it's basically the ground I stand on to even be able to make some of these claims. So the project is called the Civic Life of Cities Lab, and it's housed at the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. And with my collaborators there, I've been following a random sample of 200 nonprofits in the San Francisco Bay Area for, I guess, coming up on 2 decades. I inherited this project as a grad student and have carried it on, and we've published a bunch of papers out of it. But in this particular paper, I was looking at this whole slate of evaluative pressures that emerged in the nonprofit sector in the U.S. Around the late 1990s and early 2000s. There's just an explosion of evaluative and oversight demands and all sorts of formal oversight that there'd been inklings of in the sector before, but maybe not to this extreme of a degree. And I can get into the history of why these things even popped up. But the main kind of theme here is that it was a new set of evaluative pressures that caught a lot of organizations off guard and that they had to deal with. Just to give a taste of what these pressures were, there was everything from Congress mandating that nonprofits make their annual tax returns, and these are in the US the Form 990, available on demand. There was also an effort to digitize these forms and make them publicly accessible online, with this idea that once you put these financial forms out in the open, the rogues will, quote, think twice before they commit some act of financial or charitable malfeasance. So simply getting the information out there was kind of a concern on a regulatory front. But there were also these rating agencies that popped up. The best known ones would be like Charity Navigator, the Better Business Bureau, Wise Giving Alliance, and a handful of others that they were mining these financial forms to use their financial data to then compute ratios like the infamous administrative overhead ratio. And they were using that to assign all sorts of accountability scores based on cutoffs. Like if you spent too much on your staff, you might be penalized because according to this fairly simplistic metric, you weren't spending enough on direct service provision. So there was that set of pressures, just kind of a financial oversight and accountability set of pressures. And then foundations and funders, philanthropists, added another dimension into this kind of space of evaluation and formal oversight accountability by promoting impact evaluation and outcome measurement to the kind of the front of nonprofit discourse. It's really hard to even have a discussion about nonprofits these days without talking about impact and measurement. So there's major players like Gates, Hewlett, Kellogg, and these foundations built metrics into their logic models and so the very core of their grant-making activities. And they even established dedicated impact evaluation units. And they were very, they weren't quiet about doing this. They very much promoted these ideas to other funders and to the broader public as the right way to do philanthropy. And there was a handful of consulting firms and philanthropic advisors and funder coalitions that were all helping to spread this gospel of measurable impact. We could talk more about the fact that these are highly funder-centric evaluative demands often because they're evaluating their own portfolios and trying to compare across grantees. So the idiosyncrasies of grantees were kind of kicked out sometimes, and more simplistic measures were used. But there are also these kind of grand ambitions of trying to establish causal links, which anyone who's dabbled in the world of causality or causal inference knows is quite difficult and quite resource intensive. So oftentimes nonprofits were hit with all sorts of metrics that maybe seemed a bit bizarre or didn't quite make sense for things that they cared about, and yet they're having to report in these terms. So given this whole, onset of evaluative pressures that around the turn of the century, proponents are looking at these things as, yes, like finally we have a more objective set of tools to make decisions because humans are very fallible in their judgment and decision making, and that's something that obviously behavioral psychologists delight in telling us is just how fallible our decision making is, and so the antidote to a lot of folks was, if we use quantification and evaluation, it will help to discipline all this fallibility, and the mechanical objectivity of measurement will kind of allow us to make better decisions. And that's all well and good. We are very fallible creatures, but that antidote of evaluation and quantification comes with pretty serious complications. So when economic and organizational sociologists look at the kind of stuff that was happening in the nonprofit sector, and more generally to how organizations respond to intensive scrutiny, evaluation, regulatory pressures, et cetera, they tend to find one of two things. One of those is what we can just call the kind of decoupling account. That's frankly what it's known as in sociology, which is that organizations will do the bare minimum to satisfy all these public demands. And they'll demonstrate that everything's on the up and up. There's no need for looking any further, no need for further scrutiny. Basically, it's filing the requisite forms, checking the right boxes, adopting the right policies. It's a lot of CYA, it's symbolic stuff, and kind of an effort to maintain legitimacy. But that's not always possible. So sociologists have arrived at another account, which is the disciplining account, where when organizations can't kind of compartmentalize all these external pressures and scrutiny to these more peripheral or low-cost practices, they might end up actually internalizing the criteria by which they're judged. And in doing that, they end up forsaking their original goals. So the classic case of this is law schools that are subjected to the U.S. News and World Report rankings end up kind of forsaking some of their more idiosyncratic goals in order to move up on the rankings based on the criteria that are set in the rankings. So the fear is that nonprofits exposed to all these things would end up kind of becoming more like the criteria by which they're being judged. So from the perspective of the early 2000s, it didn't look good. And in fact, critics were very hip to this. They worried that these narrow and simplistic accountability demands would lead to a whole reorientation of the sector and possibly even homogenization of like what a sector that is known for being so pluralistic and varied and diverse. So that seemed like a scary outcome. Of course, for some proponents of all this evaluation, that was the goal, that you could reorient how nonprofits collectively thought about their work, and you can make them more business-like, more efficient, more effective, et cetera. And so this kind of disciplining perspective, as sociologists would see it, was for some proponents of this stuff, it was the point of doing all of this. And then the concern was that the emphasis, even if you didn't have this kind of disciplining effect going on, that folks would become more oriented around short-term, easily measurable indicators, and this would crowd out all the important stuff of civil society. Social movements are awfully hard to measure. Civic goals like community building, citizen engagement, those things are very real, but it's really, really, really hard to identify a specific point of intervention and then measure the effect that has had, because there's so many diffuse and knock-on effects of those activities. So that's kind of setting the stage of where this paper begins. It takes a lot of kind of setup to understand why what I ended up finding was so surprising.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, because I think just to chip in and say is, I think even though we're talking about it in the context of looking back to the the start of the 2000s or whatever, that narrative and all of those issues around measurement and both the kind of the drive for it, but also the unintended consequences of it, and the questions about, well, who decides what's getting measured, to what purpose, how does it relate to questions of accountability and stuff, feel very live right now. So I think it's, these are things that people are really grappling with right now. I guess, it'd be really interesting to hear, because the core of the paper is the idea of supererogation, which is sort of an idea that's been borrowed from elsewhere, but you've applied it to kind of explain how actually lots of the nonprofits that you tracked didn't do either of those things that you might have expected from the sort of standard sociological accounts, and actually they did something quite surprising. So
Do you want to say a bit about that?
Yeah, of course. And this is where I apologize for being a sociologist and introducing such a infelicitous term as supererogation into people's vocabulary. So my apologies for that. But I'll try to justify why I use that word, where it comes from, and that sort of thing. So when I started looking at the data that I'd collected along with my collaborators, at first blush, it kind of seemed like the typical sociological story was going to hold. Nonprofits basically detested a lot of these new demands that were put upon them. They saw them as time consuming. They saw them as kind of, as I mentioned earlier, just bizarre and not necessarily in line with what they were actually up to, and that they often missed really important things. So it seemed like you would get some sort of decoupling, like this doesn't make sense for us, we'll check the boxes and move on. But then I realized something else that was quite surprising. So these organizations weren't just doing pro forma compliance to satisfy external demands. They were also disclosing far more information in detail than was ever required by anyone. And they were doing so in ways that were quite idiosyncratic to their missions and their values. Just to give a quick sense of that, they were doing things like, on top of the evaluations they were required to do, they were devising their own bespoke evaluative criteria and even seeking out independent analysts to evaluate them in those terms. They were publishing unvarnished details of fairly contentious and often very awkward board meetings and the decision-making processes, and then establishing channels for feedback from beneficiaries and the communities they serve, et cetera. And they were doing things like elevating the voices of staff and beneficiaries whose, in their view, meaningful experiences were obscured by ratings and other reductive metrics. And so it's important to note that really no one was requiring any of this. And even some of the nonprofit sector auditors that I interviewed, because I reached out to them, say, what's going on here? They were nervous that some of these organizations were actually creating liabilities in the process of being so radically transparent. So none of this fit with the theoretical expectations that I was working with as as a student of sociology. So I set about trying to find a better account for this pretty wild explosion of disclosure. And one of the concepts I quickly was drawn to was this idea of supererogation. And I don't even know why I know that word other than the fact that I operate in a fairly interdisciplinary environment with a bunch of philosophers, and they use a bunch of fancy words, and I occasionally write them down. And when I looked this one up, I was like, oh, gee, that fits quite well. This is a term for going above and beyond. And when I looked at my data, it was nonprofits not only complying with what they were being asked to do, but going above and beyond what they were being asked to do. So on the surface, it seemed to fit the broader pattern. But the more I dug into it, the more I realized this actually really helps to explain the story. So in moral philosophy, supererogation is basically a complement to a three-part classification of moral action. And here's where I pretend to be a moral philosopher for a moment, which I'm decidedly not, but they have some great ideas. So this three-part classification of action would be things that you do because they're good to do, things that you have to do because they're good to do, to be clear, things that you cannot do because they're bad, and things that you're permitted to do because they're neither good nor bad. Supererogation offers a fourth category, which is things that are good to do, but that you're not in any strict sense required to do. So to supererogate is to voluntarily perform good acts that exceed the demands of moral obligation. Now, digging into that even more deeply, because philosophy knows no bounds and we'll pick everything apart, the philosophical use of supererogation lies at the intersection of the deontic and the axiological, or in plain English, which is what I try to speak, obligations and ideals. And so just to parse that out, obligations are the things that you absolutely have to do. They're prescriptive, they're minimal requirements of moral action. Ideals, on the other hand, are more open-ended. They're indeterminate conceptions of what is good or what is virtuous. And, obviously philosophers work themselves into knots over these things. Like, if it's good to do, why don't you have to do it, et cetera. But as a sociologist, this is a quite useful set of concepts because you begin to realize its component parts of obligations and ideals map onto social life really well. Translated into sociological terms, obligations are the things we have to do. It's the forms we have to fill out, the taxes we have to pay, the rules we have to follow, et cetera. And ideals signify these more open-ended evaluative stances of what we think to be good and virtuous, but often kind of ambiguous things. Accountability is one of those things where it has a word that we all know and we have a general sense of what it means, but in practice, it can mean all sorts of different things. And working out those things in practice can often be quite contentious. So these things of obligations and ideals in social life are very linked. Laws, regulations, standards, evaluations, they're all, they reflect broader cultural values. And in the nonprofit case, these mandatory reporting protocols, these things aren't just, the requisite forms and checklists and questionnaires. They're kind of idealized projections of what a good nonprofit should look like and ought to be. The challenge here, of course, is that different people and organizations can have very different practical interpretations of what are nominally the same values. We see this all the time in politics, where people who vehemently disagree with each other are both, touting the ideas of freedom and justice. But in practice, those things mean quite different things. If we put it in the nonprofit case, I think it's pretty common to see conversations between philanthropists and their grantees where it's clear that everyone wants to have an impact. I mean, who wouldn't want to have an impact? But the word impact is doing a lot of work coordinating between folks who have very different conceptions of what it actually means in practice to have an impact. So this idea of supererogation highlights there's a simultaneous connection between obligations and ideals and a kind of slipperiness between them. And that push and pull is really the central motor to my argument. So the idea that the argument that I advance, this kind of sociological adaptation of supererogation as applied to the nonprofit case, is that these externally imposed evaluative demands ended up clashing with how organizations, operated day to day. And it superimposed this very thin approach to accounting, what are the numbers, to a longstanding, thick set of practices about accountability to the people and the communities they serve. But nonprofits weren't able to dodge these new requirements, and they drew on these new tools and discourses around evaluation as basically a legitimated vocabulary through which they could pursue more meaningful forms of accountability, but in terms that others might understand. So it kind of lent legibility to their ideas, their distinctive understandings of accountability. And that's something I can dig into more deeply, the findings that support this, but I've spoken for quite a bit there.
No, it's really interesting. And I guess, one thing that I sort of wanted to ask is you've outlined there this, these two different poles there of the, having these obligations that are imposed on you, but then also having these ideals. And it feels as though this act of supererogation that's taking place is because they're, even where organizations are resistant to the obligations that are imposed on them, they don't feel as though the metrics are the right ones, they do share the underlying ideals of accountability and the importance of measurement. I guess what I wondered was, it feels like there would be an alternative to choosing to supererogate and kind of go beyond using those existing measures, which would be to more fundamentally just question or challenge the measures. And whilst, that might be difficult in some practical senses, in that organizations were just required for regulatory reasons to provide a certain amount of that information, did you see any signs that, as well as organizations choosing to supererogate, there were others who perhaps went in a different direction and more fundamentally said, we think these measures are the wrong ones, and that actually you're kind of, you're failing to capture the value of the work that we do. And so, rather than sort of trying to work within the system as it is, they decided to kind of more fundamentally challenge that system.
Yeah, I think that was going on. A lot of the story I feel like I'm telling is maybe something of the Davids versus the Goliaths. And I read an idea recently that rich people have peers and poor people have patrons. And so in these situations, a lot of these organizations were the poor people. They weren't able to necessarily challenge the fundamentals of what they're being required to do, because they're simply trying to get by, and they needed resources to do that. But there are cases where we do see that resistance. First of all, we see small acts of resistance, which is that you'd be required to fill out a quantitative report, but then the report would ask just for numbers, and the person filling out the report would say, "Sure, I'll give you the numbers, but here's a little story too." And I had one director, explain like, to me that number is meaningless without the story. To them, that story is meaningless without the number. So you see these little acts of subversion, and I do wonder, the effect that seeing that over time has had on people who are imposing the kind of evaluative pressures. There are larger efforts, though, to change some of the narrative. There's a moment that I think is pretty interesting. In 2007, I believe, the IRS was proposing a new form or a new version of the Form 990 that would put the overhead, and just to be clear, the Form 990 is the annual financial return or tax return for nonprofits in the U.S. And it proposed to put the well-known overhead ratio pretty much at the top of the form and demote the space that is allowed for narrative basically to the bottom of the form. And with such changes like this, there's a period for public comment, and the letters that the IRS received after they proposed these changes do reveal pretty much exactly what you're talking about, which is this idea of like, this would be hugely disruptive to how people understand our organizations. It would be enshrining a very reductive metric at the very top of a government form through which people come to know nonprofits. And so there are these more collective acts of resistance against some of these reductive metrics. But with the organizations I was studying, I wasn't seeing so much of that as I was seeing what I think of as a creative politics of evaluation, where they're kind of working with and repurposing the tools they're handed, and using them in ways that resist these very simplistic narratives about what nonprofits are or ought to be.
And in terms of the audience for the information that they're going above and beyond in providing, presumably there's no intention, or there's no expectation that the audience for that is the same one that is demanding the information that's provided as as a result of obligation. So the IRS doesn't care about this narrative information. So are those nonprofits that are doing it, are they kind of essentially speaking to an entirely different audience when they're providing that information? And who is that audience? I mean, is it their supporters or the public or funders?
Yeah, I think it's a whole bunch of audiences. It's whenever I hear the word accountability or accounting, I think there's always the question of to whom. And when there are all these evaluative pressures put onto nonprofits, there are cases where rhetorically it was, this is accountability for the broader public. We see that in a kind of government regulations where that is their goal. But when it comes to funders imposing evaluative requirements, it was largely accountability to the funder itself. And that wasn't the entity that a lot of these organizations thought of themselves as needing to be most accountable to. Traditionally, they saw themselves as being accountable to their beneficiaries, to the communities that they were products of and that they served. And so what I see a lot of this activity is doing is trying to reclaim and kind of redirect some of that accountability to whom question. So there's some efforts to do what seems like continuing a dialogue with the community that had been going on for quite some time, with a recognition that, maybe in our current era, we are a bit more geographically dispersed. The organizations we interact with aren't necessarily in our neighborhood. And so to kind of maintain the simulacrum of a face-to-face interaction, maybe you do, instead of doing town halls, you do surveys, or you do, online blogs that allow people to respond to decisions that are being made. So there's this kind of effort to reclaim some of the ideas of accountability for those audiences and redirect it in that direction.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And one thing we've kind of touched on before, in saying that actually the information that's being provided when these organizations are choosing to supererogate and go above and beyond tends to be more to some extent narrative, although you did say that some organizations got into using kind of alternative metrics and employing consultants to do that. I guess this feels like something that's still very relevant at the moment. And I'd be really interested in your views. Do you think there is, when it comes to the question of kind of measuring the value of what it is that nonprofits and civil society do, that there's this sort of inherent asymmetry between the stuff that we have hard metrics for, which tends to be the kind of things regulators are asking for, and it's financial information, and then all of the stuff that nonprofits really feel is probably their actual quote unquote value, but we don't have good measurements for that, or they're not the same kind of measurements, and you have to be more willing to accept soft measures. But often, from the point of view of regulators, or often, maybe even from funders, they're not seen as comparable, so they have less worth. So if you're contrasting hard financial metrics, that say one thing on the one hand, and then softer measures of, that are narrative or talk about outcomes or, the value to communities, it's apples and pears, and you can't really compare them. Do you think that is, something that we're still struggling with in this whole question of metrics?
Absolutely. I think it's always been apples and pears. And in some sense, folks that were trying to impose more standard or universalizing metrics, we're saying, sure, they're both apples and pears, but, they're both fruit. They both grow on trees. And while that might be true, it kind of misses there's a value of analyzing the apple as an apple and the pear as a pear in their own right. So sometimes it feels like there are efforts to, as opposed to do the universalizing metrics, kind of elaborate the criteria by which we assess organizations. And that seems like you can just go to no end, where you can just, this kind of organization or this kind of organization, they all need to satisfy, this or that criteria. And it can be, there's these kind of elaborate typologies that the Urban Institute, I know, worked on in the early 2000s that were kind of common standards for excellence. So there's this view that you just have a bunch of metrics, but I kind of lost the thread on the question there.
I mean, it's interesting because you were talking about the ideal of a universalized metric, because I guess we started for the point of talking about whether there was an asymmetry between kind of hard financial metrics and other types of softer metrics. But I'd be really interested, just to follow up on what you were saying there. That ideal that it does feel was there more maybe kind of 15 years ago or a decade ago, that actually what we need to do is find, the kind of the perfect metric that can compare across all nonprofits and give you one single measure of value. Do you think that is an entirely mistaken ideal? And have we maybe moved beyond it a little bit? It feels like that's, there's less talk of that kind of thing these days, maybe.
Yeah, I do think it's a mistaken ideal, because it assumes that the nonprofit sector is a thing, that it's a clearly bounded thing, and that organizations, because at least in the U.S. case, they are 501c3s under the Internal Revenue Code, inherently have something about them or within them that is comparable or worth comparing, or that it makes sense to try and compare. And that's often leads to pretty crazy things, where you end up comparing, you probably shouldn't compare Stanford University to a soup kitchen, because they are both 501c3s. They're both nonprofits. There's all sorts of diversity in the sector. So thinking of the kind of universal metric does lead to a lot of really odd conclusions. So that's definitely, I think that was more of a tendency in the past. And there's been a lot of recognition of the follies of trying to think this way. I'm not saying that people were actually trying to compare Stanford to soup kitchens, but the metrics do allow for that. And that was always an odd thing. There's a much more, there seems to be a divergence right now in the ideas around evaluation. Some folks seem to have given up on the idea that you should, try to have unifying metrics for the sector, but have instead focused their charitable or philanthropic efforts on things that you can very clearly measure and compare. So we see a lot of this concern with, are there, clearly identifiable effects of some given intervention? So the effective altruism movement is very good about this. They love being able to find metrics that convincingly demonstrate something, and then be able to put money behind that. But the cost of that is ignoring the whole chunk of activity, a massive chunk of activity that doesn't easily fall under this kind of easily measurable category. So there's a lot of civic stuff that we want that isn't necessarily conducive to clear measurement. So I think there's one direction going that way of this kind of more hard-nosed, do we have a randomized control trial that shows that this works, direction of funding. On the other hand, we have this kind of recognition that maybe the metric obsession was the wrong way to go. And there's something Hal Harvey wrote a few years back where he basically apologizes for promoting strategic philanthropy and advises that people maybe should just drop their hubris, write the check, and get out of the way. And I think we've seen that picked up by a handful of high net worth donors, where there's more of this trust-based thing, or where people are saying, we're going to take the reins off a bit and just allow you a little more freedom. So I think there is a movement in that direction as well. The challenge, of course, is, metrics have all sorts of problems, but so too does a more relational or trust-based form of giving, because metrics have this emancipatory potential where, or democratizing potential where, people are compared in terms of their outcomes. Relational, methods of who do you know or who do you trust really, moves things toward, what are your biases? Who do you know? Like, did you go to business school together? Do you look similar to each other? Do you sound like each other? And that also is prone to all sorts, introducing all sorts of inequalities and biases in giving.
Yeah, I think this is such a fascinating question because I think in terms of the question of the shift towards trust-based approaches and away from measurement, and there's definitely the version of it which is it's hugely positive because you're getting away from largely kind of top-down funder-driven metrics that are inappropriate and are a means of kind of exerting power over recipient organizations. But then, as you say, the other way of framing trust-based approaches, which sounds like an inherently positive thing, is that it can be potentially kind of exclusionary. And you are right that actually, if you are limiting the way that funding is going to existing circles of trust, then that in itself becomes problematic if there are no means for people who are outside the circle of trust to break into it. And actually, in that sense, it's potentially more meritocratic, to allow to have some form of measurement or to reinstitute things like open grant applications, which is interestingly. I think Mackenzie Scott has done that with a portion of her giving more recently, in kind of recognition of precisely that challenge. So it feels like a really interesting but a kind of a difficult time for the whole question of where we go in terms of measurement, because there is the potentially this divergence. One thing I wanted to ask, actually, this kind of feels like an additional dimension to that whole challenge is when we're talking about who is imposing these measures, I guess traditionally we would have been talking about regulators or at an individual level, maybe funders, and then we kind of have the emergence of non-profit specific intermediaries kind of coming in and establishing themselves as offering some version of measurement. As giving increasingly feels like it's happening more and more online through digital platforms, do you think that's going to have an impact? Because again, it feels as though you could just offer this stuff in an entirely unstructured way and just let people make their choices however they want. But probably if you're a platform, you're going to recognize that there's a consumer demand to kind of inform choices and have those choices shaped somehow. And that's going to lead you back to this question of, well, how do we kind of point people towards things they're going to like or that are good? But then that's potentially now in the hands of entirely for-profit companies whose kind of incentives maybe are not at all aligned with those of civil society. So do you think this is kind of a new front on which we're going to have to think about some of these issues as well?
Absolutely. And I think in some ways that's been going on for a while with, in the US, Charity Navigator is a major one of these. Their website, in some ways, feels like you're shopping for an impact. You go on there and, it's like, what cause are you interested in? What organizations satisfy, these criteria that we at Charity Navigator have, determined to be important markers of a good, trustworthy organization that has an impact. And then, you can click and donate. And in some ways, that's great because it allows access to things. Like I know it's fairly common now when there's maybe a natural disaster, which there are way too many of, that people will want to give to the place they just heard about going through something horrible. And Charity Navigator offers a great service for that, where you can go on there and say, hey, like, where's the local food pantry? What's the local health clinic or whatever that I can contribute to? At the same time, these kind of platforms are really framing, in some ways, how we even think about the act of charity or engaging with these organizations. I don't even think they need to be for profit to have maybe some problematic effects in this way, because simply they're not mere conduits of the world that is out there. They present the information in a particular way. They prioritize and rank and sort things in particular ways, and that informs what we see. That informs how we think about these organizations. That informs what we think charities are even for. And I think the whole kind of construct of shopping for impact is very different than the idea of civic engagement, which is the other story about these organizations. There's a long, decades long concern about civic decline and people not being engaged in community organizations. And I do wonder sometimes if these kind of online platforms are a product of that, or in some ways actually help to propel some of that by reframing how we even think about engaging with civil society.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I've thought before, I've had conversations with people about whether the decline in participation in more traditional forms of giving, and whether there is some element of that being that people are shifting to other models of giving, whether that's giving to kind of non-traditional organizations or just sort of peer-to-peer, and whether that is a reflection of the traditional non-profit sphere having become too transactional. And exactly, this would be an absolute case in point, isn't it? As you say, the presentation of supporting civil society, as you say, in framing it in terms of shopping for impact, absolutely emphasizes that it's a kind of monetary transaction almost on a consumer basis, rather than something where you are asked to genuinely kind of participate and to give your financial resources and time and whatever else on a voluntary basis to kind of support organizations. So I think that question of whether it's which way around the causation runs there is really interesting.
For sure. And I do wonder if in some ways the nonprofit responses that I've seen to these this earlier wave of evaluative pressures has actually helped to propel this mindset and normalize it a bit. So the really positive spin on the supererogation story is that these organizations were able to reclaim what accountability meant to them, and they were able to do it in basically a new, often very quantified language. But they were able to maintain their distinctiveness and idiosyncrasy in the face of these kind of homogenizing pressures. But I've wondered if these organizations have upped the ante on quantitative evaluation, if they've ended up crowding out other forms of knowledge or ways of thinking about engaging with these organizations. So it's like, yes, I know you firsthand, but I'd rather see what the numbers say. In some cases, maybe that makes sense. In others, that's kind of a ridiculous thing. If you trust the daycare center where you send your kid, but you also want to see the numbers, it's like almost unlearning to trust our gut. So I do wonder if in some ways that's a negative long-term effect of this kind of change in the sector's basic language of accountability toward a more quantified front, as opposed to a more face-to-face relational sort of accountability.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wondered whether the fact that these things are intermediated, even if the information that you're providing kind of through supererogation is intended to be for those supporters and whether it's the general public or funders, actually, because it's happening in an intermediated way through this kind of a ratings agency or a reporting structure like that, even though you're providing the information that you want to get to that audience, you're not necessarily building the relationship of trust that might happen if you were speaking directly to that person or interacting directly with them. Yeah, it's really interesting. I just wanted to take a slight left turn here. I'm in danger of taking up far too much of your time, but I wanted to ask, because you had another piece out recently on a different topic, but I think the two do link together a bit, which is about the rise of LLCs, so limited liability companies, as a kind of alternative model for a particular type of philanthropist, kind of elite philanthropist, particularly often ones from a sort of technology and Silicon Valley background. And you kind of outline in that some of the narrative about why people, what people say about why they're using this and what the potential benefits are and what some of the potential downsides are in terms of accountability and kind of transparency. And I guess, maybe to link that to what we've been talking about already as a starting point, in that you talk about, the potential that actually maybe it might be that we see that people using these LLCs, even though the regulatory requirements around transparency and disclosure are lower, can we be optimistic that there will be a similar process of supererogation where they will decide to use them, but then go above and beyond in terms of how much information that they publish? Is there any, should we be optimistic about that? Is there any sign of that happening as a process?
Yeah, you're talking to a sociologist, so I'm, dispositionally a pessimist, I guess. But yeah, so in some ways, there's plenty to laud about a handful of LLCs because they really don't have to be transparent at all. That is what the law permits, and in fact, that is part of the the attraction of the LLC to philanthropists. It's unlimited for-profit investing, so you're not kind of really stuck in a nonprofit sphere. Unlimited political lobbying, funding political campaigns. There's no spending requirements. You can have cozy relationships with your for-profit, partners, which the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and Meta, and you can dissolve it and take your money back. And above all, when it comes to accountability in terms of reporting things, there are no reporting requirements as opposed to with a traditional philanthropic LLCs philanthropic foundation. So the LLC proposition in some ways is basically saying, take me at my word. I'm trust me, I'm rich, and take me at my word, I'm doing philanthropy, and hoping that their idea of philanthropy lines up with your idea of philanthropy. So it's interesting when there are a handful of very prominent LLCs that are going above and beyond what they're required to do. And again, to be clear, what they're required to do is basically nothing. And reporting. There is, I know the Midyar Network publishes its investments, financials, various perspectives it has on society on its website. Doesn't have to do that. CZI has a searchable grants database, which granted is only nonprofit recipients, and at that, it's not all of them. And Laura and John Arnold have been quite committed to openness and transparency, and also very critical of DAFs and other forms of giving that are possibly even less transparent. And we've seen Jack Dorsey with his infamous spreadsheet, the Start Small initiative, where it's a Google sheet listing all the money he's given. So yeah, these organizations are going above and beyond in terms of transparency. But my critique is that in doing that, they are helping to legitimize an organizational form, the LLC, that basically leaves the question of whether or how billionaires should be held accountable to the billionaires themselves. And so I wonder if our attention to the good guys is allowing some of the less good guys to kind of get by without any criticism. So a possible implication of supererogation in this case is that it may actually allow others to suberogate, if you will, or simply completely skip on all commitments to society and being accountable for what they're doing with their wealth.
Yeah, no, I think that is really interesting because, it's true. I guess, interesting to note if there are people going above and beyond, but if the fundamental point is that there's been a change in the nature of accountability from one where it is something that is, demanded as a matter of duty or obligation by a regulator authority to one where we're just sort of hoping that the wealthy people themselves decide to do it. That is a pretty fundamental difference, and one that we should probably be pretty concerned about.
I think it creates a sort of almost public ambivalence about the methods through which people are giving, so long as they're giving. And I think my message in some ways is to say that the methods actually very much matter here, because some of them are just frankly unaccountable.
And just on LLCs, I mean, it's probably a topic for an entire podcast in itself. I mean, one of the things that gets highlighted as the positive benefit of it, because most donors don't come out and say, "Oh, I want to use it because I find the reporting requirements of a foundation too onerous, and I want to be less transparent about my philanthropy." It tends to be a narrative about not wanting to impose arbitrary boundaries upon themselves about the types of organizations they can invest in, or whether you want to kind of blur the lines between for-profit investing and philanthropy. I mean, do you think that we should be concerned even about that positive narrative? I mean, do you think that there is something to be said for carving out a specific sector or a set of acts used to support it that are distinctly non-profit, and to sort of get away from the idea that we should all be kind of free and easy about just blurring the lines between the commercial sector and the non-profit sector?
So that idea has kind of sent me for a loop recently, and myself and a collaborator, Micah McElroy, have been thinking about if this is the case and the lines are truly blurred between what is for-profit and non-profit, because the ultimate question is social good, then in some ways the LLC approach to philanthropy is inviting a critique not just of philanthropy, but of wealth, and that these people even have the right to make these decisions at this scale about what society should look like. So yeah, I think there's definitely a line blurring thing. I don't want to say, I don't think that businesses are inherently incapable of doing social good, or that nonprofits inherently do social good. And so the lines are very blurry, but I think the fact that they're blurring does open it up to a new line of critique that those of us who are critical of philanthropy maybe should be, setting our sights on an even larger target, which is the right of wealthy people to make these decisions in the first place. Yeah,
absolutely. And I guess, in terms of whether, I think that distinction there between, I think the sort of naive distinction, sorry, not to call you naive, but I'm trying to use it to capture the sense, but certainly not the idea that doing social good would be the sole preserve of the non-profit sector, and businesses can never have a social purpose, because that clearly, there are clearly many counterexamples that would disprove both of those. I guess the thing I can't decide myself, but I think is really interesting is there some unique value to the idea of doing social good in some context, using models and methods that have particular characteristics, whether that's the kind of no expectation of financial return, or having some sort of legal embodiment of the principle that once money's given away it can't be returned, or that kind of thing, or is it that actually over time we could replace all of traditional philanthropy with social purpose businesses, or would something get lost in that process? I feel like the answer is yes, definitely.
Yes.
but being clear about exactly what it is, I think I need to think about it a lot more.
Yeah, so I do think that there is something lost in that process. And I think some of the fact that there is this blurring is that so much of, as you were mentioning earlier, the nonprofit sector and philanthropy has come to feel very commodified and transactional, that makes it harder to distinguish from for-profit activity. It makes grant making and active investing. And I think some of that reveals a deeper shift from a focus on the act of giving and what that entails, and all the social stuff around that, the act of participating in community, the act of identifying and using your money in these particular ways, and refocused our attention on the effect of giving. We've become consequentialists. And I think in some sense that has shifted our expectations of nonprofits, where they're not bulwarks of community or civic organizations, but they are low-cost service vendors that we expect them to do a thing. So I think in some ways, maybe we've already lost some of what is worth redeeming about the distinction between charity and more for-profit, approaches. But I do think it's still there and it's worth redeeming.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a positive no to which leaves it. Listen, I could talk about this stuff for a lot longer, but I think you'll probably test people's patience. But maybe I'll twist your arm and get you back on at some point in the future, and we can pick up. There's a whole load of notes on here about things that we didn't even get around to talking about.
For sure.
But yeah, no, just remains to say thanks ever so much, Aaron, for finding time to do it. It's great to have the chance to chat. Really interesting stuff. And just a final call. If you've got anything coming up or anything that you want to sort of draw people's attention to, now's the opportunity. I'll put links in the show notes to the stuff we've been discussing and the paper and the articles and things so that people can find that. But if you've got any other things that you want to plug, please do take the opportunity.
Right now, I'm just kind of hard at work and thinking through a book. Cool. So I'm deep in that hole. But in the meantime, if people want to check out my work, my website is the easiest repository of it. So I just post everything I write there. And if people have questions about it, email me. I'm happy to chat.
Cool. And I'll put a link in the show notes to that as well, so people can find you easily. Well, thanks ever so much for doing it. Great to have a chance to talk.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to Aaron for coming on the podcast. It was great to have a chance to talk to him, get into some really kind of substantive questions about the research that he's done and the kind of wider issues around accountability and measurement. As promised, I'll put links in the show notes to where you can read the paper in full, and also a shorter article on HistPhil where Aaron's kind of summarised what the paper's about and what the findings are. And I'll put links to places where you can find more information on Aaron and his work, and also some things that I've done that you might be interested in that are relevant. If you're interested more broadly in issues around philanthropy and civil society, which if you've made it to this point in the podcast, I'm guessing you are, do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com, where you can find all of the episodes of this podcast. You can also find lots of articles and bits of news and bits of video and things about philanthropy and civil society. Follow me on social media. I'm on Twitter at Rodri_H_Davis. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on various other places as well with varying degrees of enthusiasm. If you've got ideas for things that we could talk about on the podcast or people that we could interview, do drop me a line. You can find my contact details on the Why Philanthropy Matters website. And I know some of you have taken advantage of that recently and got in touch to suggest ideas or people that I could talk to. So thank you very much for doing that. And if you have the time and the inclination, please do go to wherever it is you get your podcasts and leave a nice review so that people know that this is worth listening to. I think that stuff all helps. Other than that, I will see you next time. Bye!